Good morning. We're going to start, try not to get into the habit of starting side events late, and we have a packed one, so we really need to get started. Hello and welcome to the side event on the need for fast, fair, full, and funded phase-out of fossil fuels. I would like to start the side event by acknowledging a colleague who did a lot of work to make this event happen, and that's Catherine Abreu from Destination Zero. Thank you, Kat, for the help on setting this up. So as I said, we're here to discuss the fossil fuel phase-out conversation within the UNFCCC and outside. We said it needs to be fast because the climate crisis cannot wait. It needs to be fair because justice and equity must be at the heart of the energy transition. It needs to be full because we will not accept weasel words. We will not accept false solutions as a way to delay from this inevitable transition. And it needs to be funded because an equitable phase-out will require support. The success of COP28 will be judged in large part by whether we get a clear signal on the end of the fossil fuel era and a clear signal that the renewable energy revolution is on its way. Bonn, the SBs that we're here at today, needs to pave the way to a comprehensive decision or set of decisions on this. And it's more than ever, we cannot tolerate and we will not tolerate that these topics are not on the agenda when the negotiations happen. Today you will hear from a variety of speakers coming from a wide range of experiences and approaches when it comes to the fossil fuel phase out. You will hear from the voice of science and what science has to say on the need to phase out fossil fuels. You will also hear from countries and subnational actors doing the hard work to phase out fossil fuels and to push this topic on the international stage. And you will also hear finally from a number of civil society organizations that are very involved in this fight and are trying to drive the right outcomes in this process. So without further ado, and recognizing that we have a lot of speakers today, I will give the floor to Olivier Bois-Von Korsk, who's from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Thank you, Olivier.
Thank you, Romain, and hi, everyone. So my research is based on analyzing and interpreting outputs from integrated assessment models. So mainly I've looked into the integrated assessment model from the IPCC, the IEA, intergovernmental organizations, as well as models from energy consultancies in order to get an overview of what the science say on 1.5 degree pathways. So since the last few years, I've really focused on the question of what do energy scenarios tell us about 1.5 degree compatible energy future. So more precisely, I've focused on fossil fuels and specifically oil and gas. And so there are many such scenarios, and there's very different assumptions and outputs. Hence, to be policy relevant, IAM analysis needs to select scenarios that are most linked to what is happening in the real world. So at least try to understand what is going on between the scenarios in order to assess the impact of different policy assumptions on the climate. But before I show you what 1.5 degree scenario tell us about oil and gas phase-out pathways, let me first show you what is the future of oil and gas production just from what is currently planned in the pipeline. So this is just the embodied carbon emission in the fields that are already producing or under development today. And then we can also add to this the projects that are under development at the moment, for which a final investment decision has already been made. And then on top of this, we can also add the fields that are not yet developed, but for which license has been granted and final investment decision is still pending. And then there's also the embodied carbon emission from the expected development of new fields for which license is also granted. So now let me add to this or superimpose the IPCC median estimates of 1.5 degree scenario with a feasible amount of carbon dioxide removals. So based on an approach that was first pioneered by the Climate Action Tracker, we filtered the scenarios from the IPCC 6 Assessment Report database in order to select the one that had a level of carbon dioxide removal that met the IPCC feasibility threshold for the deployment of carbon dioxide removal and fossil CCS. So as you can see from the figure, the oil and gas consumption in IPCC pathways can be met entirely with the fields that are already producing, hence seeing that there's no need for new oil and gas, and to partly answer the question of what do energy scenarios say about oil and gas production is that no new fields are needed. However, there are many variations in IPCC scenarios, and so here are the 3 illustrative mitigation pathways that are published in the IPCC Working Group 3. So they're based on very different assumptions, and so there's many sort of drivers of variability in these scenarios. So mainly, the main drivers are total energy demand, non-CO2 greenhouse gases, also assumption on carbon dioxide removals, land use changes, and as well as the pace of coal versus oil and gas. So all of these drivers are the most influential for oil and gas phase-out pathways, but the one that have the most sensitivity on oil and gas phase-out pathways is really the amount of carbon dioxide removals. So, and IMP-SP, the one on top, is actually based on a policy assumption that would replace carbon dioxide removal, so a bit slower phase-out because we phase out much more faster short-lived climate pollutant, mainly from the agricultural sector instead, so methane emission and such. So now for comparison, let me also show you the scenario from the International Energy Agency net zero emission scenarios, which permanently revealed that no new oil and gas were needed in a 1.5 degree world. And here is a range of other 1.5 degree scenario from intergovernmental organization, energy consultancies that also show the same thing, mainly that the IEA conclusion that there's no room for new oil and gas is widely shared and robust across 1.5 degree scenarios. And now I'd like to turn to the corresponding amount of wind and solar deployment that would be required if we are to effectively phase out oil and gas consumption at the rates shown in the IPCC 1.5 degree pathways with a feasible amount of carbon dioxide removals. So here is the investment scale-up that would be required to meet that energy demand by 2030. So we estimate that about 830 billion would be required annually by 2030 in order to effectively scale up wind and solar at the rate required to meet the IPCC 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways. However, only about half of these investments are expected to be spent by 2030, leaving an investment gap of about 450 billion annually by 2030. On the other hand, the oil and gas industry is expected to spend about 570 billion in 2030 alone in new oil and gas projects and new exploration. So by itself, these investments could easily bridge the investment gap. So it's just to say that there's no lack of energy capital globally. It's just that it's simply flowing into the wrong places, namely into new oil and gas development, which, as we showed earlier, are inconsistent with 1.5 degrees Celsius based on the IPCC scenarios and a wide range of others. Hence, this is why we need supply-side policies in order to tackle this problem. And that's why I'm happy to hand over to colleagues representing the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which can talk about what they're doing on this issue to address this problem. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Olivier. Thank you so much for restating the fact that no new oil and gas is compatible with the 1.5 pathway, and that the investment gap could be filled with the money that is being spent on new fields. Thank you so much. We have time for one question or two to Olivier, if anyone is interested in knowing more. Yes, the lady over there. Laurie? Could you raise your hand, please?
Hello, thank you for sharing the presentation. Do you think there is a main action to at least short the gap that you said regarding solar and wind capacity? Any recommendations to close that in a timing? I mean, to be not that a different gap from another investment needs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. And yeah, so basically there's a lot of policy and finance scheme that can be implemented in order to reorient capital flows towards renewables. So this can be done either from multilateral development bank that can also facilitate the the finance towards wind and solar, especially in developing countries. So there are many barriers to finding the capital, but also into finding the right projects. So because of high interest rates in developing countries and also of the project finance, they can be harder to finance. So it is indeed necessary to have support from intergovernmental organization, also to design projects and identify pipelines in order to follow the money. But it's also specifically subsidizing fossil fuel to such a large extent, and this will enable to reorient private domestic capital flows from the government towards renewables.
Thank you. I think we have another question at the back and then at the front. Over there.
Thank you very much for your informative discussion. I'm Caroline Aguti, and I come from Uganda. I work for the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development. I think the concept of promoting solar and wind is very good. But in your research, have you factored in the aspects of the intermittent nature of solar? And also, as we go on promoting the aspects of solar, I think the waste management components on how best to manage the waste from solar is not being factored in. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. So our research is based really on global models. So, I mean, the IPCC showed in the third working group a sixth assessment report that wind and solar have the most mitigation potential at the lowest cost compared to other technologies by 2030. So that's why we focus specifically on these technologies, and this is also where there is a significant investment gap and where we need to reorient finance. So of course we need to take into consideration regional level issues. Not all countries have the same grid infrastructure, and storage capacity needs to be also factored in countries like Uganda in order to be able to effectively deploy the wind and solar capacity needs.
Here
And then we're going to have to move on.
Thank you. My name is Wiebke Thies from GIZ. Yesterday, I visited a side event of the International Energy Agency on the energy sector pathways to 1.5 degrees goal. And there, Thomas Spencer from the IEA, a modeler from the IEA, said, investment, public and private, into clean energy was $1.7 trillion last year. And this year, investments in solar PV is surpassing investments in oil production. And that this is a revolutionary moment that we should remember in future. Does that fit to your information you gave just now?
Yeah, I mean, the data we use from the IISD comes from last year's publications and last year's scenarios. However, I think that this is indeed something that we should celebrate. I was also there at the event yesterday. And so the fact that there's a 1.7 to 1 ratio for renewable energy versus fossil fuel, I think it's something to celebrate. But in order to be aligned with 1.5 degrees Celsius, if I'm not wrong, I think the IEA said that we need to have a ratio of 9 to 1 by 2030. So there's still a long road ahead to go into upscaling renewable energies. And although the shift, the momentum is moving towards renewable, there still needs to be significantly more support to accelerate the transition.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Olivier, for your presentation. Let me call to the stage our colleagues from Denmark, from Vanuatu, and from Quebec. Welcome. So in this panel, we're going to hear the perspectives of countries and parties and subnational actors about, what it is, what it takes actually to phase out fossil fuels. And we're going to start with the example of Denmark. And we have Jeppe Helsted, who's the Deputy Chief Negotiator for Denmark, who's going to talk to us about the Danish experience and the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. Jeppe, you have the floor.
Oh, now it's on. Thank you so much, Zhang, and great to be here. Good afternoon, all. I guess it's afternoon exactly now. So yeah, I'm happy to share a little bit about what we've been doing in Denmark, both on the national front, but especially on the international front, which I think might be the most interesting for people to hear. Back in 2020. The end of 2020, there was a broad political agreement in Denmark for the future of our oil and gas production in the North Sea. So Denmark has been an oil and gas producer since the 70s, I believe, and it's been a sort of a major part of our economy and of our energy system. But it was decided in 2020 that to put an end date on this, to say that we shouldn't produce any oil and gas beyond 2050, and this was sort of a marquee decision, and as I said, based on a broad agreement in Parliament. And as I said, of course, the Danish oil and gas production has been significant in a Danish context, but maybe not that significant globally, since Denmark is a rather small country. So an important part of this agreement was that we wanted to make sure that it had sort of a broader climate effect than what we can just do from the sort of in Denmark domestically. So in the agreement, the politicians asked that Denmark should try to promote this internationally as well, and try to gather a group of countries, or try to encourage countries to make similar decisions as we have in Denmark. And that was why we were very happy to engage actively in the creation of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. I assume that many people will know BOGA in this room, but this was an alliance that was launched at COP26 in Glasgow, bringing together countries that are committing to addressing the production side of oil and gas, and such as setting end dates or ending licensing rounds for oil and gas. And the idea was to bring a group of first movers together that could rally around the need for the managed phase out of oil and gas production, which we see as an important part of the puzzle for the phase out of fossil fuels more broadly. And I was fortunate enough to be part of this from the beginning. I would have to say that sort of from somewhat humble beginning, I'm quite amazed at what we are now, where we're discussing it in rooms such as this, and indeed other rooms during this session, and it's become sort of an important part of our conversation, both in and outside the negotiations, which I think is a huge step forward. So we realized that this is difficult work, that the energy system we have now, which also reflected in our presentation from IISD, is built on fossil fuels, and it requires quite a lot to change that, and to change our course of direction. So we realized that these are not easy decisions. It took a while for Denmark to get to where we are, including some tough political choices. So we also realized that governments will need time to deliberate internally and to address this issue. But fortunately, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, BOGA, continues to grow, and today we have 19 government members and friends of BOGA, and also governments in the alliance are implementing the commitments, and we'll hear from Quebec after this, also on their experience in actually sort of doing concrete policy action to address this. And then sort of outside BOGA, but in the negotiations, it was also sort of a huge step forward in COP27, even though we didn't manage to include language on fossil fuel phase out in the end decision there. We had around 80 countries coming forward and supporting that language, which I think was a huge step forward, and certainly something that we will continue to build on. And as I said, the topic is now regularly brought up in conversations under the negotiations as well, often also with the recognition that we need to rapidly scale up renewable energy, as was also mentioned before. We recognize that the producer countries in the global south especially face particular challenges. So Roman was mentioning equity, and that again this is not sort of easy decision, especially for producer countries in the global south. So under BOGA there's also been set up a facility, a funding facility with our excellent philanthropic partners that can support just transitions beyond oil and gas production in the global south. So just wrapping up, I think we've come a really long way in the last 3 to 4 years that I've personally been involved in this work, and where we from the Danish side have been actually promoting this, and of course that builds on years of engagement and advocacy, especially from civil society, and we're very well aware of that. And I think now we can see that real change is on the way, and we're doing all we can to build on this momentum towards COP28 and beyond. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeppe. Our next speaker is Olai Uludong, who's an advisor to Vanuatu and will talk about Pacific leadership when it comes to the phase out of fossil fuels.
Thank you, Roman. Good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to join this conversation on looking at the fossil fuel phase out as fast as we can, as urgent as we can. As many of you know, we came out of COP last year in Egypt, and the states have always been the moral voice of the convention. And climate change in terms of pushing for well below 1.5, no higher than 2 degrees for the survival of our islands. Coming out of COP27, the leadership of Vanuatu and Tuvalu had convened a dialogue alongside the discussions to see if the Pacific could really look at pathways towards transitioning away from fossil fuels. Not sure if many of you know, but the Pacific small island developing states, most of them are still at the most 100% still heavily reliant on fossil fuels. A lot of the countries now are moving into renewables and other alternative forms of energy. But that's having said that, economically for the Pacific Islands, a bulk of their GDP is actually spent on fossil fuels. So the thinking that from the leadership of Vanuatu and Tuvalu was, how do we look at it from the global perspective, but then really start at home? And how do you drive change in terms of a just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels, given that nationally determined contributions show that the Pacific that we emit the least, but in terms of sustainable development, we are reliant on still dirty technologies and of course oil and gas. So they had that conversation, and the Pacific countries had wanted to after the COP, go back to the Pacific. And in March, Vanuatu and Tuvalu convened the Port Vila Call for Action. And it was really to look at understanding each of the different circumstances of the Pacific, but then come and focus on the heart of the challenge of economic development is in the fossil fuel sector. So the countries got together with other like-minded Pacific countries that wanted to look at a just and equitable phase out of fossil fuels, and really brought in not just the countries, because often we have these meetings and it's only the countries that get to speak to each other. But this call for action requires that we include the regional organizations from the Pacific that have the mandate. For example, the forum that covers climate and security for the Pacific, and then you have the SPC, which is the Secretary of the Pacific Community, which is the technical backstopper for energy and transport in the Pacific. So bringing all those actors, and as well as so many international initiatives were coming into the region. For example, the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, as well as the initiative, the Diplomatic Alliance Initiative by Denmark and Costa Rica on Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. And then there's the Clean Air Coalition. There's the Pacific Blue Shipping Initiative. There's so many initiatives that are out there that are coming in to say, this is what we think a just transition looks like. And then you have other initiatives that come in and say, this is what equitable transition looks like in a fossil fuel phase-out discussion. Having said that, this group of countries then supported and adopted this call for action that we need, in order for us to transition away, we need the technology, we need the finance, we need the human capacity. And that, that sort of became the Port Vila call for action, where we had civil society, regional organizations, international organizations like IRENA, and the countries themselves then take that call and proposed it to the wider Pacific community. Then in May, Vanuatu again hosted the regional energy and transport meeting of all the ministers in the Pacific. And it really showed that when you do focus on the biggest sectors, which is energy and transport, that rely heavily on fossil fuels, the issue that you face is they transition differently. So when you talk about just and equitable transition, no one size shoes fits all between energy and transport. But at the end, you have one objective. How do you then phase out fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner? The 27 member Pacific Island countries and territories then decided and agreed that we need to pursue, and going into spaces like the UNFCCC, we now need to pursue a just and equitable transition to ensure that, yes, if we want to go renewables, and yes, it's the renewable technology, a lot of companies and corporations and countries are coming into the region, some of them through ODA with the technology, but is it the right fit for purpose? And the countries in the region had wanted to say, in order for us to transition, in order for us to then encourage the world to do a phase out, there needs to be a just and equitable transition in the Pacific. Because as many of you know, small islands can be incubators for change. And while we emit less, the technology that's coming in needs to be fit for purpose. And we need to ensure that we get the financing we need, we get the technology, need the appropriate technology, as well as partnerships. So that is the intention with coming from the region and then towards this SB 58, is that how can countries, regions, and the international community come to a collective agreement that there is a need for a just and equitable phase out. And we have to understand that in most cases, the PSIDS have the challenge of not having the capacity and capability and financing to do so at the speed and scale that is required. So that's sort of what the Pacific is now gearing towards, from the regional coming to the international and going to the COP, is really, we understand, but in order for us to survive, we also need a just and equitable transition at home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olai. We're now going to hear the perspective from a subnational actor, the province of Quebec in Canada, that's been leading the way on fossil fuel phase out and is an active member of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. So Julianne Bossé, who's from the Ministry of International Relations from Quebec, you have the floor.
Thank you, Romain. Happy to be here and share Quebec's experience, and also to give you a little bit of background on how Quebec came to adopt a law that banning oil and gas development on its territory. And I will give you a little bit also a context of the main aspects of that law. I would start by saying that Quebec has, in the past years, implemented various climate policies, energy policies. The government also has set a goal to reach net zero by 2050. It has also put more and more emphasis in transitioning to a cleaner and more sustainable energy sources in Quebec. So it has been implementing various initiatives in promoting energy transition, renewable energy, but also to reduce its GHG emissions. Of course, hydropower is at all our strategies are very focused on our hydropower production. I think we have 99% of our electricity that is produced, that is from hydro. So the government is investing a lot in that. It's also investing in projects such as wind power, solar energy, bioenergy, green hydrogen. So investment in clean energy has always been a priority for our government. So it was in that context that the government of Quebec committed in 2021 to banning oil and gas development activities on its territory, and also the public financing of those activities. And then we joined Denmark and Costa Rica in the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance as a core member during COP26. And for Quebec, that was a significant step. That commitment was a significant step to accelerate the energy transition that was needed in Quebec, to reach our net zero goal, but also to be sure to be in line with the Paris Agreement goals. It was also, I would say it was also coherent with our government priority to focus on energy transition, but also on the production, on energy, clean energy that is produced in Quebec. So a few months after that, the government put its commitment into a law that came officially into effect in August 2022, so almost a year from now. And since then, all licenses that are related to hydrocarbon exploration and production activities have been revoked. The law also provides for the permanent closures of all wells that were drilled under those licenses, and the restoration of the sites. We also establish a compensation program for the licenses that were revoked. So yeah, so here we are, and the next step for us would be that we focus on the proper implementation of the law, proper restoration of sites, our compensation program as well, and we have also some interesting projects that we will try to carry out. We intend to carry out some pilot projects that would help us acquire some geoscientific knowledge related to CO2 sequestration, storage for hydrogen, geothermal, for example. So we're very happy to be able to share our experience, and we as a subnational government as well, and we hope that we can encourage others to follow suit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So you've seen, this was a clear demonstration that the phase-out of fossil fuels is not a theoretical matter. It is happening in a lot of places. It is not easy. It requires a lot of effort, a lot of political leadership, but it's happening, and there's momentum growing behind it. And we're here to hope and to push for this process here to reflect the momentum that's happening in the real world. Before we move on to our civil society friends and partners, I was wondering if anyone had any questions to our speakers. Lady at the back. We'll only take 2 questions. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Wait, do I stand? Apologies. This goes to Julianne, was it your name? Yeah, I'm a student at Quebec. I just moved there, so I was trying to learn more about how Quebec works when it comes to climate justice, social justice, and I was wondering, where does the intersectionality with the Indigenous community come in Quebec's action plan in these coming few years?
Thank you for that question. I work at the International Affairs Ministry, so I'm not like super closely involved in the drafting of the policies and in the consultation process. But every time we develop a policy, there is obviously a consultation process with civil society. For example, our green economy plan, we had different groups of consultation for Indigenous people, for youth, for businesses, for different industry sectors. So we really make sure whenever we develop any policies, we elaborate any strategies that all the stakeholders are involved in the decisions.
Thank you. I think there was a question, the gentleman. Excellent. All right, thank you very much for your interventions. You are now free to go back over there. And you can as well. Don't worry. So we're now inviting our civil society friends to provide their perspectives on the phase out of fossil fuels. Please join me here. And we will have one speaker who's online as well. Adrian, Tracy, Ahmed, and Catherine. Sit wherever you want. Excellent. So yeah, we thought to keep things feisty and lively, we would invite our civil society friends to provide their own perspectives on this topic. And we are going to start. Tracy, are you okay to start? Yeah. All right. We're going to start with Tracy Carter from Greenpeace International. And Tracy, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Roman. Hello, colleagues. So I'm going to talk about finance because another critical aspect of a fair fossil fuel phase out is, of course, finance. And there are many dimensions to what that means in terms of a fair phase out. And I'm going to focus on making polluters pay. So as we know, developing countries need finance for just transition, for mitigation, for adaptation, for loss and damage. And that finance should come from the corporations, critically the countries and individuals that are most responsible for climate change and those that are most able to pay, not least the fossil fuel industry as the single greatest contributor of emissions. So we are currently at a point in history that when not only do we have record global emissions from fossil fuels, but we're also seeing the fossil fuel industry enjoy massive record profits at the same time as more people than ever are facing loss and damage from a rapidly changing climate. And as we know, those are the poorest countries and communities who have contributed least. They're the ones who are paying the highest price. I'm sure you're all familiar with the profit numbers, but they do bear repeating. So in 2022, just 5 of the world's biggest oil and gas companies saw record profits totaling nearly 200 billion. That's just 5 companies. You know, never has climate injustice been so profitable and so pronounced as it is at the moment. And these profits were not the result of any extra investment. They were not the result of any extra effort or any extra risk on the part of fossil fuel companies. You know, these profits are very much the spoils of war and, you know, were born out of crisis. So yes, we need to see an end to the fossil fuel era and fast. But while phasing out, the fossil fuel industry needs to pay for climate action and it needs to pay for harm caused. And the mantra must be, you know, not only to stop drilling, but we need to stop drilling and start paying. This action to make polluters pay, though, not only will that generate finance, but it will also help with the transition, because when you tax something, you get more of it, of course, and when you reward it, you tax it, you get less of it, and when you reward it, you get more of it. Unfortunately, the story to date has been one in which governments have really enabled the fossil fuel industry to generate vast wealth without having any responsibility to pay and being exempt from that. And 2023 for us really needs to be a turning point on that front. Just as after the financial crisis in 2008, we had a window of opportunity and a moment for change. We are now, in many ways, because of these record profits, at a watershed moment when it comes to making polluters pay. This year, we need national governments to be introducing domestic measures. Northern governments have to go first, take the lead, introduce windfall taxes with a share of revenues for loss and damage. And we also need to see governments collaborating internationally to progress equitably designed international measures such as a tax on extraction, also known as a climate damages tax. So from the PAC summit in Paris in 2 weeks' time to COP28, we need to see progress. And I really want to underline the importance in that progress of designing measures to ensure they have no net costs for recipient countries, because we shouldn't end up with them contributing to a source of finance that they're meant to be benefiting from. If that's the case, it won't be fair, and there's going to be a lot of opposition. So to finish, I want to say at last year's Climate Finance Ministerial, for those of you who were there at COP27, we heard John Kerry saying, once again, that governments simply don't have the money to significantly scale up finance. And he's not alone in saying that, but we've got to reject that outright, because, the problem here is not lack of money. There are plenty of ways that governments can generate vast sums by taxing public goods, public bads for public goods, and there's vast wealth that's accumulating that can also be taxed. We don't have an absence of money, we have an absence of government action. And I want to underline, this isn't about voluntary contributions from the fossil fuel industry, it's not about charity. This is squarely about government action to hold the fossil fuel industry to account and make polluters pay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Our next speaker is Katarina Rahal from Human Rights Watch, who's going to talk about the intersection of fossil fuels and human rights. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Romain, and thank you to the other panelists. My name is Katarina. I work for Human Rights Watch, which is an international human rights organization, and we document human rights abuses around the world. In my team, we focus on human rights abuses in the context of the climate crisis and looking at fossil fuels and all stages of fossil fuels is a really strong focus of our work. And I want to talk to you briefly about that and why that's the case and what it means in this context of the UNFCCC and the phase out of fossil fuels that I think we all agree we need. So as I just said, we've documented in our work, and many of those investigations are underway around the world, that all stages of fossil fuel use, so exploration, extraction, production, storage, transport, refining, combustion, and disposal, are linked to human rights abuses. From Louisiana's Cancer Alley in the US to the East African crude oil pipeline in Uganda and Tanzania to the coal fields in South Africa, just to give a few examples, to recycling plants that are treating European plastics made from fossil fuels in countries like Turkey. We've been interviewing people who are experiencing these harms day to day, whose health is at risk, who have trouble accessing clean water, whose right to a healthy environment is being violated. And importantly, many of these frontline communities that are fighting every day to defend their human rights, they are also under risk. Their lives are under risk because of the work they do. And that is a huge concern, I think, locally, but it's also a concern to all of us here globally if we're talking about the phase out of fossil fuels, because these communities on the front lines really need our support. So what we consistently find, and I also want to emphasize that, is that these local human rights harms and also the impacts of the global climate crisis, they don't impact people evenly. We know very well from our research, really talking to people about their experiences, but also from other studies, that those who've contributed the least to the crisis are those who are most impacted. So what follows from that? I think governments, and we've heard already from panelists today, that's very encouraging, have a really strong interest in phasing out fossil fuels domestically to really protect the human rights of the people on the front lines. And that is something that I think is, we heard the motivation of why that's already happening, but there's another argument here, and this is really about legal obligations. Governments and all governments that are part of the UNFCCC process have existing human rights obligations. And as part of these obligations, they need to protect and fulfill the rights of communities, including the communities that are currently being impacted by fossil fuels and fossil fuel use. And so that is really an additional argument, and one that helps also. There was talk earlier about policy coherence and how it needs to be brought together. And I think human rights is certainly an important human rights are important standards also when we're talking about just transition. I think there's one particular consideration this year for COP28, and it's applying in other contexts as well, but I want to emphasize it because we're talking about a reference to fossil fuel phase out for COP28. So having a country like the UAE as a conference host, I think places the issue of fossil fuel phase out and respect for rights squarely on the COP28 agenda. As you know, the COP28 host is a petrostate, and it's also a state with a deeply repressive government that is aggressively expanding its fossil fuel industry. So the repression of peaceful dissent and laws that prohibit free association and assembly and deny the right to privacy are considerations that when we're talking about fossil fuels, fossil fuel phase out at COP28, we need to take that into account. Because such repression, and that's happening, of course, in many countries, creates fears, and I think unfortunately justified fears, among those planning to attend COP28, especially among civil society and civil society from the global south, who may not feel that they have the support and protections that other with more privileges have and feel secure to attend. So I think there could be repercussions of this situation in the country that is well known on issues that are really squarely on the climate agenda. And we're very concerned about that situation. And I think it's really a moment now to recognize this and to emphasize that these issues are closely connected. We're seeing it on the ground locally, but I think also at the global level. We can't ignore the fact that respect for rights, including respect for basic civil and political rights in every country, for climate activists to be able to speak out, that this is really a precondition and a requirement for any ambitious climate action. So with that, I'd like to wrap up and just emphasize that I think this year's COP is an opportunity, but it requires all governments and also civil society to recognize and kind of step up their support for the phase out of fossil fuels and respect for rights. I think these two are interlinked, and we need to now focus on both. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katarina. So we've heard a lot about the UAE presidency and the UAE, and indeed the UAE is the third largest expander of oil and gas production, or is soon to be. But there's a country that oddly enough flies under the radar a lot when it comes to oil and gas production, and that's the United States, which is by far the largest expander of oil and gas production in the world. And so we wanted to invite Adrian Salazar from the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance to tell us, to share his experience of what it is, what it's like to face that degree of fossil fuel expansion in the U.S. You have the floor.
Thank you, Roman. And thank you to the other panelists here. On the topic that Karina just was raising, the climate crisis is a crisis of inequality. And this is true at every level. So subnationally in the United States, we have a history of the disproportionate burden of pollution, from water pollution, air pollution, to the impacts of climate crisis falling on Black, Indigenous, communities of color, poor communities. And that is the result of histories of racial discrimination that have been embedded and reinforced by policies over generations. And so when we talk about the phase out of fossil fuels, what's at stake is actually trying to tackle that history of inequality for the United States. And Greenpeace put out a report a few years ago on what they call fossil fuel racism that outlined that burning fossil fuels, they did a survey of about hundreds of studies, that burning fossil fuels disproportionately impacts Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor communities. It harms public health. Oil and gas production releases hazardous air pollutants that disproportionately burden those communities, and that phasing out fossil fuels would immediately improve public health and tackle the climate crisis and address those historic injustices. And so this is the context in which an organization like my organization, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and the allies that we work with are operating in when we try to resist the oil and gas expansion of the United States government. And I'll say that despite, I'll talk a little bit about what's been happening in the U.S., but despite the ramp up of oil and gas production over several years, we found, as a grassroots organization, that resistance wins. And a lot of our comrades are Indigenous communities and on the front lines of climate crisis that have been stopping fossil fuel pipelines. And there's an analysis that one of our allies, Indigenous Environmental Network, put out that showed of 20 fossil fuel projects that have been stopped and delayed in North America in the last 10 years. Indigenous resistance basically reduced greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 25% of annual U.S. and Canadian emissions. The resistance of stopping those projects prevented that amount of carbon emissions going out into the air. So in the United States, it is a difficult context to organize under, but we can win. And if we win in the United States, then it's possible that we can win in the global level. In the last couple of years, if you've been tracking United States politics, we have been trying to fight for ambitious climate policy at the national level. In the last few years, when we had Democratic control of our Congress and the Biden presidency, we had a narrow window to pass climate policy. And there's a lot of back and forth and negotiations on the proposals that were put on the table to reduce emissions. And there was a major bill that was passed last year, the Inflation Reduction Act, which you may have heard of, that is estimated by the government's projections that it will reduce greenhouse gas emissions about 40% below 2005 levels by 2030, and positions the U.S. to meet President Biden's goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in half and net zero no later than 2050. But that bill, that law now, it also actually had embedded in it mandated fossil fuel expansion. And it had, because of the horse trading that had to go on with Republicans and centrist Democrats, policies that mandated more fossil fuel leasing and a quid pro quo of if there is more solar and wind production, that there needs to be also more fossil fuel production. It's wild, right? And in the last year, we've seen the Biden administration approve a massive amount of oil and gas projects. The Willow Project in Alaska, which opens up a vast swath of public lands to oil exploration. They have approved Alaska and Gulf Coast LNG terminals. They have permitted more public leasing of oil and gas leases than the Trump administration did in its first 2 years. And And they have just passed a bill that includes the approval of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which goes through Appalachia, that many communities have been resisting for years. So it's a very difficult context. As Romain said, the U.S. government is committed. Do not be persuaded by how they posture in these halls. They are committed to continued oil and gas extraction and expansion. And this is what our communities are resisting and fighting for. And we have been, in instances, successful. Last fall, a part of this Inflation Reduction Act included a deal that the president made for an additional bit of policy that would undo environmental regulation, prioritize certain projects as national priority projects, including fossil fuel projects, and that deal was stopped. It was stopped by grassroots organizing 3 times in a row, and so we have been able to try to resist some of this continued oil and gas investment at the national level, but they continue, this government and Republicans and moderate Democrats continue to try to push for oil and gas investment and expansion. I'll mention one last thing, which is that the UN Secretary General is hosting a Climate Ambition Summit in New York this September. It's a really critical and pivotal moment nationally in the United States and also globally. As we know, we're going into this COP at the UAE. But the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has said that the ticket to entry for countries into this summit is a commitment to stop fossil fuel expansion. Now, we hope that that is a hard line requirement for countries to enter, and that the Biden administration and other polluting countries follow through on that commitment in order to demonstrate their own climate leadership. But it is an organizing opportunity for us as civil society organizations to demand it. We know they're not just going to do it voluntarily. So for all of the folks here who are working with governments in their own countries, we encourage you to advocate for your country to make those commitments, like many of the countries who just presented here, to wind down fossil fuels and use that moment to in September to leverage the leadership of your, demand the leadership of your governments to do what is necessary to advance climate justice.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adrian. Our next speaker is online, if that works. That's Lily Four from the Center for International Environmental Law, and she's going to talk about a question that's inextricably linked to the question of fossil fuel phase-out, or that's trying to be, at least, the threat of false solutions. Lily, you have the floor.
Thank you, Romain. Thank you for allowing me to participate virtually. I will only arrive in Bonn in 2 days, so looking forward to catching up with some of you in person as well. So during this event already, we've heard that the science is crystal clear around the need for a phase out of all fossil fuels. And yes, as Katarina mentioned, not just for energy and transport, petrochemicals such as plastics and synthetic fertilizers are fossil fuels too. And we've also heard about the fact that proven and readily available solutions exist and they can be rolled out. But all of that means that the fossil economy is really under threat. So those who are profiting from business as usual, they're putting all efforts into greenwashing and delaying action. And their tactics have changed in the last couple of years. So the new denialism is really built around dangerous distractions and techno fixes. And that's what I want to explain a little bit more. Carbon capture and storage, CCS right now, is their first line of defense, and carbon dioxide removal, CDR, really they cover up for expanding the fossil economy. For CCS, the IPCC synthesis report already highlighted, very clearly that huge barriers exist for CCS, and that global rates of CCS deployment are far below those that we can see in the modeled pathways. And it also makes it clear that CCS is, the mitigation option with the lowest potential and the highest cost. And those findings are really confirmed by real-world evidence, because most of the existing CCS projects in the world are actually enhanced oil recovery projects. So they produce more oil. They do not reduce emissions. And CCS has a decades-long history of really over-promising and under-delivering, and comes with a huge energy penalty. So despite having been around for decades, CCS facilities really across the globe currently capture less than 0.1% of global emissions. It's clearly not a solution that we can count on in this critical decade ahead. So promoting it as a means to abate fossil fuels is greenwashing, and it's misleading the public. And for that reason, CCS is also turning into a new battleground for climate justice in the US and in other places. For carbon dioxide removal, I would say that as the fossil economy is really threatened by the economic viability and the competitiveness of renewable energies, as we've heard, the big polluters and the fossil fuel companies are promoting CDR technologies as a cover-up for expanding their business. And many of these approaches, bioenergy with CCS, direct air capture with CCS, they depend on CCS. Depending on these and counting on these, solutions is clearly not aligned with IPCC findings. The IPCC in its 6th assessment report has left no doubt that irreversible impacts would come from overshooting 1.5, that there are huge physical uncertainties that we could ever do large-scale carbon removal, and that reliance on future CDR really delays deep emission cuts now. And these new technologies come with immense risks and harms for ecosystems and communities and people's rights. And then there is, solar geoengineering or solar radiation modification as the ultimate big bad techno fix, as I would call it. It's not in the IPCC models yet. It's clearly not a solution. It introduces lots of novel risks and harms. Not going to go into detail. It's not yet on the official UNFCCC agenda, but it's coming up in many, many international fora. And there's a real danger right now of normalizing solar geoengineering as a policy or, climate response option, which is why over 400 leading scientists are pushing back and calling for a solar geoengineering non-use agreement. But CCS and CDR proponents really cite the IPCC to support their claims. And yes, they can cherry pick some evidence and to explain why. I think we need to understand that the negotiations in Intl in Switzerland for the 6th assessment report really highlighted a clash between the indisputable physical signs of the climate crisis on the one hand and the mainstream economic models that underpin the mitigation pathways and perpetuate a business as usual approach. So models and scenarios, such as the ones Olivier at the very beginning of this event talked about, are built by economists and are just as biased as our economic thinking and system are today. And on top of that, governments came to the session in Interlaken with, yes, legitimate concerns, but also some vested interests. So what we got in the end with a summary for policymakers was a negotiated text. The IPCC is not policy prescriptive, but to be policy relevant, the mitigation pathways presented, by the IPCC need to match the urgency and the scale of the problem presented through the physical science. And the implications of certain policy choices have to be transparently communicated to policymakers. My conclusion on that is that the most ambitious mitigation pathways put out by the IPCC in its reports really only set the floor, not the ceiling for necessary climate action. And governments, including BOGA members, must not get distracted from the key path ahead. We cannot abate fossil fuels or manage carbon by storing it, safely underground forever. There's just no way around phasing out fossil fuels. And I hope that governments, will remember that for the September summit and the COP, and that we must ensure that whatever, entry ticket they hold for that summit has no gigantic loophole, through CCS. And yes, Olai said technology and finance needs to be fit for purpose. So this is true for all of these approaches. We really have no time to waste with these dangerous distractions, and we cannot afford new escape hatches for the fossil economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. That was really eloquent and a reminder of why we're talking about fossil fuel phase out and not a phase out of fossil fuel emissions in this event. And our last speaker, but absolutely not least, is Ahmed El-Droubi from the CAN International Secretariat. You have the floor.
Thank you, Romain, and thank you all for attending. What I've wanted to say has changed a lot since I've heard all these other inspiring speakers. So so one thing I just wanted to point out is one of our members of CAN is an organization called 350. 350 is not a random number or a dance move that they chose to name their organization after, but it's talking about the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is expected, that we should not break in order not to surpass 1.5 degrees. I think now we're a little over 400, closer to 410. And therefore, all this talk about net zero in 2050 means that until 2050, we're still going to be increasing that concentration. And so we are years and years behind on phasing out of fossil fuels. And Human Rights Watch very clearly highlighted the atrocities that occur because of the fossil fuel industry. We can see devastation of environmental systems and ecological systems happening across the world. We can see the massive impact on public health. But we can also see assassinations that were conducted historically associated to fossil fuel industries. We can see wars where the main profiteers were those associated with the fossil fuel industry. And therefore, it seems more and more that this industry is inherently connected to human rights infringements. And this is something that really needs to be, well, it's one of, on a long list of reasons why we need to phase out fossil fuels quite quickly and rapidly. But what we see is this bit of a dilemma. When we go to a country like Algeria or Angola or Colombia, who have fossil fuel deposits, they're not the biggest in the world, they're not the US, they're not China, they're not Saudi, where a country like Algeria, 89% of their exports are fossil fuels. On the African continent, there are approximately 600 million people that do not have electricity. There is nowhere near sufficient mitigation funding, mitigation climate finance, for them to build and develop infrastructure using renewables. But at the same time, the countries that are refusing to provide, to be held accountable for their historic emissions, the companies from there are knocking on their doors and saying, hey, we're here to dig out your fossil fuels and provide you those resources that you need to develop this much-needed infrastructure. And this much-needed infrastructure are schools, hospitals, roads, housing. So these aren't luxuries. Therefore, we cannot talk about the urgent and vital need for a rapid and just phase out of fossil fuels without talking about a just transition and without talking about historic responsibility and accountability for that historic responsibility. And therefore, we need to have a much broader approach and a much more comprehensive approach rather than siloing these negotiations into mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. Going into Dubai this year, we are going into a region where the fossil fuel industry has a very high social license, where it is the source of employment for a great proportion of the population, and is seen as the lifeline, the reason why this region and this country have acquired their wealth and privilege. And therefore, it is extremely challenging in this setting to develop this narrative. But civil society must be up to that challenge. And we must come together in order to put the pressure on, and put the pressure on a comprehensive solution, not one that tries to take on the aspect of mitigation alone. I think I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. That was very, very interesting. Let's give a round of applause to our speakers, please. All of our speakers. We now have 5 minutes for questions to any of our speakers. Or was that too much for the audience? We have one over there.
Hi. Also, there's important when we talk about the phase out that we also talk about the green energy projects that are happening on the expense of local communities, which is happening, let's say, in Israel-Palestine, where the Bedouin communities in the Naqab are being kicked out, so there will be solar, and Israel is getting money for that, and being the leader in the Middle East in technological transition to just energy. And I think this is also very important to look at the human rights violations in this transition. So it's not just in the phase out, but also in this transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Did we have another question over there?
Hi, thank you for being here today. I'm not sure if this is like the right panel to ask, but I was just interested in what you think the travel industry looks like after we potentially successfully phase out fossil fuels. So we've already talked about inequality, and there's the issues with travel, getting around. We are all very lucky to fly from wherever we come from in the world to be here today, and that has had a huge carbon footprint, just this in itself. And then the same thing is going to happen again with COP28. So I'm just wondering what you think the travel industry will look like in the future, and who will be able to take advantage of traveling. Like, will you have to have a private jet, or will you have to have some fancy solar-powered plane to travel? I'm just wondering.
I don't know if we have any airplane industry expert on the panel. I don't know if anyone has anything to say about that. I don't think so. I'm sorry. We have a gentleman over there and the lady at the front.
Hi, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I'm Mauricio from IISD, here located in Bonn. And what I wanted to ask a little bit more about is when we see the investment gap and when we see the opportunities maybe to tax fossil fuel consumption, that's one side of the coin. But there's also the opportunity to remove harmful subsidies, for example, for fossil fuels. We see that fossil fuel subsidies have gone up also in light of the energy crisis, and that right now we are investing. We are actually supporting the fossil fuel economy to produce more. So I was lacking a little bit of reflection on this. If any of the speakers would like to add on this, I would appreciate their thoughts.
Thanks for that question. Fossil fuel subsidies, I think, this year, with the profits as high as there are, the production subsidies, there is no justification for those right now. So, 100% need to end. And then in terms of the massive increase in consumption subsidies, one of the biggest problems is that so many of them are untargeted price subsidies. And what we need is a shift to consumption subsidies that are targeting vulnerable households with energy poverty, and that will help, reduce on the consumption side. And in terms of, generating finance, I think there is that potential for releasing revenues when you reduce these subsidies and spending it on the kind of things we've been talking about, just transition, loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm afraid we're going to be thrown out of the room imminently. So I'm going to end the event here. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you to all the speakers. And have a good day.